So you got to be very brutal about these things, and stop being so emotional. I mean that's a fundamental problem with the way Indians look at the world. And by the way, I'm not. Every other country looking at this whole thing is sort of wondering why are the Indians so can't set aside one thing and say, okay, let's focus on the big picture. The big picture is the economic game.
印度这个国家真的很神奇，哪来那么多的自信啊？什么都要跟中国比，却又从来不正视中国，总是带着敌意与偏见，自己的问题呢看不清，总是嘲笑别人的问题，并且大做文章。这是一段印度某资深主持人与新加坡学者马凯硕之间的对话访谈节目。视频里主持人居然还说中国强迫穆斯林吃猪肉，说中国不保护穆斯林，也不想想当年1947年印度教是如何对穆斯林大屠杀的。中国的少数民族可是被最优待的优待到连汉族人民都羡慕嫉妒的。比如说高考加分的教育优待政策、计划生育优待政策、服兵役优待政策等等。有人说一看到印度人在高谈阔论民主、自由、人权时就想笑。一个把人分成3、6、9等的种姓等级制度的国家，还谈什么人权、自由和民主
Okay, the one thing that China is not open about, when you're suggesting that India's economy should be open and to be protectionist is actually protecting vested interests. What about democracy? What about political and civil liberties? And I ask this because there's a huge question around, for example, China's treatment of its Muslim population, and this is a story that never even gets addressed, never even gets spoken about. We saw a shocking story on Al Jazeera this week, which spoke about Muslims in internment camps being forced to eat pork every Friday as part of what's called re-education. Do civil liberties not matter at all? When it comes to India, the whole world comments. When it comes to China, everybody's quiet.
Well, I think, as you know, India was very upset when Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday made some comments
about the farmer protest.
Yes. And I think we in Asia are wiser than the West is. And just to put it in a big historical context, I've been a student of the West for a long time. The West has lost its political domination. It has lost its economic domination. It only now has intellectual domination. And it preserves its intellectual domination by lecturing the whole world on human rights issues, when the West, as you know, is completely hypocritical on human rights issues. I'll give you a simple example. The European countries will condemn any country that carries out torture, right? If India carries out waterboarding, the European countries will be the first to insist that India stops waterboarding. But when the United States was the first major developed country to reintroduce torture, the European countries kept absolutely quiet. But whenever any government tries to criticize any country on human rights, I say they've got double standards, because they will only criticize their adversaries and not their friends. And just, since you mentioned how bad the human rights situation is in China, in the 1971, when the United States was fighting the evil Soviet empire, it had a choice. It could either join the world's largest democracy in India to fight the Soviet Union, or it could fight the largest communist government in the world, which, by the way, under Mao, saw far greater human rights abuses than anything you have in China today, right? Far greater. And you know what? The great democracy, United States, chose China over India. And I think many Indians, if you don't mind me saying this, can be very naive about geopolitics. Geopolitics is not about friendship. Geopolitics is not about whether they like you or love you. Geopolitics is all about what's in my interest, and that's what they will do. And so I think it's important to the European Union also wanted to impose human rights standards on India also. So that's what they've been doing all the time. So it's important in geopolitics to be, as I said, calculate what is in your interest and do what's in your interest.
But what happens then to civil liberties? I actually agree with you. I agree with you on the one point that you make, that a lot of commentary by the Western world is full of humbug and full of hypocrisy. I mean, I remember this time, for example, when Obama was on a presidential visit to India, and before going, he made a lot of comments about the constitutional sort of need to preserve pluralism in India, which of course is all true. But then he took the flight from here to Saudi Arabia, where he didn't say anything of the kind. So one does see all of these gaping double standards. And I agree with you on that. But when you think of these Muslims in internment camps in China, and you hear the horror stories that come out, should the world look the other way? And there are things, for example, when you look back at, let's say, apartheid and Africa, there have been moments in history when global pressure has pushed change. So, is your binary really sort of always applicable?
No. By the way, I want to emphasize that we should advance human rights.
Yeah.
Because, I don't want to live in a country where my nails are being pulled out, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But just since you mentioned apartheid, I mean, you must surely know the reason why the apartheid regime was so resilient and could survive so many years is because United States and United Kingdom supported South Africa. And you know that the United States Congress declared Nelson Mandela a terrorist. And do you know that they only removed the terrorist title 6 years after apartheid ended? I mean, look at that. So you tell me that United States is a defender of human. United States.
I don't care about the United States. I'm just asking how the world should react. The world is not the United States.
True. But at the same time, I completely agree with you. But as you know, if someone came to India and lectured India publicly and say, why did you tear down the mosque? Why do you do all that? Everyone's going to react very badly on Xinjiang. And I would say, frankly, if it's about Muslims, don't you think the Muslim countries should take the lead? How is it that when the Western countries wrote a letter criticizing China, not one Muslim country supported that letter, not one.
But when you speak about the silence of the Muslim countries, one of the countries of the world that has remained silent is Pakistan. Right.
Yes.
And from an Indian perspective, Pakistan now is seen almost as a kind of vassal state of China. And so when these border tensions, in fact, erupted, one of the things that the Indian military had to war game was for a possible two-front conflict, and it's always war game for that. But there's a kind of, Pakistan is sort of being seen as a continuum of China. How do you see that relationship? Obviously, for China, it's all about self-interest. For any nation, its choices are about self-interest. There, I agree with you. But from an Indian perspective, we're looking at this. We're looking at Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. We're looking at the sort of, one road project, and we're going. Pakistan is just like now an addendum, almost an addendum to China.
Well, in international affairs, I always believe that the biggest problem is when you get emotional, right? Mm-hmm. And if Pakistan was a complete vassal state of China, why does it go to the IMF when it needs assistance, right? Mm-hmm. It's a vassal state of China. It should say, to hell with the IMF, to hell with all that. I mean, that doesn't make sense. And so I would say that, it's a big mistake to use labels, okay? Yeah. And it's also important to ask yourself, again, if you don't mind me being very frank. So why does India always focus on problems of the past, on differences, and not focus on what can be done to learn lessons from others and learn to find a better way? There are better ways.
How do you see, for example, the Pakistan-China equation?
Well, I think, geopolitics, as I told you earlier, where just as the United States chose the world's largest communist country under Mao Zedong as a partner, countries don't care what your internal system is about. If it suits their geopolitical interests, they will work with the country. And right now, there's a convergence of geopolitical interests between Pakistan and China. So that's what happens. So, and just as there is, by the way, a convergence of geopolitical interests between India and United States today. That's what's happening also. And that is not driven by the fact that they like each other or believe in each other. It's about geopolitical interests. China and Vietnam are far greater adversaries. And look at the trade between Vietnam and China today. It's amazing. So, and at the end of the day, why is Vietnam doing this? Let me tell you why Vietnam is doing this. Vietnam is trading heavily with China, not because the Vietnamese love China. They are using China to make themselves strong in the same way that China used the United States to make itself strong. So you use your adversary to make yourself stronger. Now that's the best game of geopolitics you can play.
Okay, I have some questions for you on our live stream that I want to actually just pick up one by one. First is that Abhishek Singh says the onus of resolving the differences between India and China at the moment should be on China. Why blame India?
I'm sorry. I can only help you by being very frank. I've studied geopolitics for 50 years. I don't know of any geopolitical dispute where one side is 100% right and the other side is 100% wrong. So as you know, in the case of China and India, the border dispute, you also know that 3 times the Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, proposed to India, we will never be able to figure this all out, this border dispute. Why not just accept the line as it is and settle as it is? And as you know, 3 times India turned China down. That's also a fact. And frankly, I think it was unwise to turn down that offer. It was very unwise because that would have settled the matter. And as you know, China has settled its border disputes with Russia, with Vietnam, with Mongolia, with everybody else. It's settled. So it is possible to do a deal. And I think it's important, therefore, to figure out at the end of the day, if you want to succeed, you got to figure out what are my bigger, more fundamental interests. And this is a marathon race between China and India. It's a marathon race. We will know the winner 100 years from now. And the marathon race will be determined by who has the stronger economic legs.
We have a question on our live stream from Sanjay who says, no, I don't agree. The free trade agreement between any country and China can only benefit China because trade with China is a one-way street.
Okay. By the way, trade can never be one way.
I think the point is that it's not a level.
Excuse me. You know something? Yeah. If it is all one way, you know what's going to happen? Nobody. If others don't benefit from trading with China, then they won't have money to buy goods from China. To buy goods from China. And by the way, if you look at Southeast Asia again, it's amazing that the Southeast Asian economies, which were behind China in so many ways, many of them have surplus with China. And by the way, it is possible to negotiate a free trade deal with China where the China will give you unilateral concessions temporarily to enable you to catch up in the competition. And China was very generous to Southeast Asia in giving what they call an early harvest in that.
So I want to give you a sense of how a lot of Indians feel, and that's why I'm picking up an emotional question, even though you spent a lot of time of the conversation saying the one thing you should never be in geopolitics is emotional. But this reflects how many Indians are thinking and feeling today. Nandita Ghosh on our stream says China wants to push India into a war and then it will crush India. There is a sense, what you call the marathon competition on between India and China. There is a sense that there's room for only one winner here. Right, and that is why the kind of sort of coexistence that you're speaking about, even though there are not the kind of historical conflicts that India has with Pakistan, with China, and I remember Modi used to say before this border conflict that not one shot has been fired at these borders for decades. That unfortunately now doesn't apply. We're actually seeing a kind of, we've seen a military conflict. But how do you address this Indian apprehension, which is very real, which is very widespread, that now the narrative is it's not Pakistan, it's China that's the real adversary. It's China that has blocked, for example, UN sanctions against terror groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jamaat-e-Dawa. You've served as the president of the UN Security Council. You know what these concerns are about. So just address that concern that China does not even stand on the issue of terrorism.
Yeah, I can see the question from Nandita Ghosh. China wants to push India into a war and then it can try to crush India. Yes. Sometimes some truths are very painful. The Chinese are very, very concerned about a war. They're very concerned about a war with the United States. Very concerned.
Right.
because the United States is clearly trying to push China down. I mean, that's obvious, for obvious reasons. And if you go to Beijing, and I, because I've been there a few times, and you mention India, they look very puzzled. Oh, really? They're concerned about us? Why? China, I was amazed at the indifference of the Chinese to India. Because for them, their number one threat, and by the way, there'll be a monumental struggle between US and China in the next 20 years. The Chinese have only one obsession. They got to survive this US onslaught against China, which is coming, which is, as I say, I've documented in my book, Has China Won? And they are focused on that. And so as a result of that, that creates opportunities for others. So it creates opportunities for Southeast Asia. Because in Southeast Asia, because China doesn't want Southeast Asia to become an anti-Chinese lake, the Chinese are doing their best to build win-win economic partnership with Southeast Asia. And I can guarantee you this, that if you can sit down and have a rational dialogue, where you've got to push aside your emotions for a while, you'll find that China will be very happy to work out a win-win arrangement with India too, for the same reason that they want to focus on the United States. And you're right to point out the major trade deficit between US and within China and India. You're absolutely right. But there are ways and means of dealing with trade deficits. And, for example, when the United States was very worried about the major trade deficit with the Japanese, as you know, the United States and Japan had negotiations, and the Japanese agreed to what is called VERs, voluntary export restraints. So, that what I'm saying to you is there's no problem in the world is new. Every problem has got a precedent. And so you can find ways and means of dealing with it, and then take advantage of the larger market.
And there are questions on that, and I'll come to that. But if the Chinese are indeed indifferent to India, how do you explain this mass military buildup at the border with India? Well, why block sanctions against terror groups like the JUD and the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar?
But as you know, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Exhibit A, Mandela. Mandela was called a terrorist by United States, as you know. But on the cases you mentioned, yes, it's unwise of China to block the designation of terrorist groups. I agree with you there.
Talking about technology, how do you see the Indian move to block a whole host of Chinese apps?
Oh, I would say that's peanuts. Peanuts.
Why?
Life is much bigger than this TikTok, PUBG. And this is an example of being petty. It's peanuts. The Chinese don't care. The Chinese, remember, from the Chinese point of view, there is a much bigger game. And you can ban TikTok, you can do all that. It doesn't hurt China at all. No, zero hurt at all. But the important thing to ask, actually, what if I was an Indian?
Yeah.
I would ask a very simple question. My number one competitor today is China.
Yeah.
What is China doing right? What is China doing wrong? What is India doing right? What is India doing wrong? And then calculate. And then I can tell you, let me come onto your program 10 years from now.
10 years. Okay.
10 years from now.
Long,
and I'll tell you the world. And I'll tell you what the world will be. 10 years from now, United States will be number 2. China will be number 1. And you know what? China and the United States will come to some accommodation. 10 years from now.
What will happen to China? And China and India? Where will China and India be 10 years from now in this equation, in your opinion?
It all depends on how cunning India is. It all depends on how you play the game. Right. You see, right now, you have a window of opportunity because China is still number 2. It's much easier to negotiate with the number 2, not with the number 1. But you want to wait 10 years? Then when you negotiate with the number 1, it's much harder. So you got to be very brutal about these things, and stop being so emotional. I mean, that's a fundamental problem with the way Indians look at the world. And by the way, I'm not, every other country looking at this whole thing is sort of wondering why are the Indians so can't set aside one thing and say, okay, let's focus on the big picture. The big picture is the economic game.
Right.
And are you winning the economic game, or are you losing the economic game?
看完这个视频啊，我觉得太难为马大爷了。这是什么水平的主持人啊？娱乐节目吗？马大爷也真是的，你接受采访时你也得挑一下选一下呀。如此低智力、充满敌意与偏见的对话，真的快把马大爷聊崩溃了，聊吐血了。这简直就是一位智者与一位纠缠不清的嗡嗡苍蝇之间的对话。如果大多数的印度精英们都像这位资深的女主持人，或者像之前的甲亢姐一样的智商、情绪和心态来看待问题、讨论事务的话，那印度将永远成不了真正的大国。马凯硕是一位真正有深刻洞察力、高瞻远瞩的政治家、学者。他的观点几乎以神的视角在看世界、看人间、看地域冲突。我看过很多期马老的访谈节目，这是他情绪最激动的一次，都是被愚蠢给逼的。正如马凯硕所说的，印度要正视自己的问题，抓住历史的机遇，再过10年，中国将变成地球最强势，那个时候再跟中国谈合作就更难了。